There's a saying in law that a good lawsuit has to tell a compelling story. I just read Nick Sandmann's defamation lawsuit against NBC Universal Media LLC. It tells one heck of a compelling story. For those of you who don't know me, I am Viva Frei, a Montreal litigator turned YouTuber turned accredited mediator. I do these things on YouTube called Vlogs, VLAWGS, where we break down and analyze a legal issue that's going on in the news or the world at large in terms that can be understood by lawyers and non-lawyers alike. I have been promising for a while to do a breakdown analysis of Nick Sandmann's defamation lawsuit against various media outlets. For those of you who have been living under a rock in a cave in the mountains somewhere, Nick Sandmann is the 16-year-old Covington Catholic high school kid that was thrust into the media spotlight based on a 60-second, highly contextually inaccurate video that was tweeted and that went crazy viral. The media ran with the story and created what can only be described as the most vicious of media frenzies, in which Nick Sandmann was depicted as a racist, a white nationalist, promoting hatred. In a few short hours, Nick Sandmann went from being an unknown high school kid to the personification of racial hatred in America. News outlets like the Washington Post, CNN, NBC Universal ran with story after story after story, even after it became clear that the original video was both taken out of context and completely unreflective of what actually happened. The original 60-second video appeared to show a grinning Nick Sandmann, 16-year-old white kid wearing a MAGA hat, staring down Nathan Phillips, a native elder. In the media frenzy that followed, stories began to emerge to the effect that Nick Sandmann and the other kids were shouting racist slurs, intimidating Nathan Phillips, the native elder. And once the full video of the situation emerged and people actually took the time to analyze what had happened, it turns out that the entire story was flipped. That the Covington Catholic kids did not approach Nathan Phillips, but rather Nathan Phillips approached the kids and began banging his drum in their face. That there was another group called the Black Hebrew Israelites that were in fact shouting racist slurs at the Covington Catholic kids, calling them all sorts of names. But once the full story emerged and the reality of the situation became clear, it didn't matter, the damage was already done. People were calling for the doxing of these kids. Nick Sandmann had become the face of hatred in America. And not only were some media outlets slow to issue retractions or corrections, others didn't do it at all. And in the weeks and months that followed, in addition to trying to reclaim their privacy and reclaim their image, Nick Sandmann began filing defamation lawsuits against the various entities that contributed to what can only be characterized as a total character assassination. Now, before we get started breaking down the Nick Sandmann defamation lawsuit against NBC Universal, like, share, subscribe, hit that notification bell if you like my content, but for now we are going to analyze in great detail Nick Sandmann's defamation lawsuit against NBC Universal. In a way, the practice of law is sort of like construction. It's all too easy for a lawyer to criticize the work of a previous lawyer or another lawyer. Very rarely are you going to find one contractor who's going to praise the work of the contractor before him. It's very easy to find fault in work done by others. My father always says that the person who never makes a mistake is the person who never does anything, and it's very easy for the people who didn't draft to criticize. That said, I read this lawsuit beginning to end, and this is a textbook example of what a lawsuit should be. This is not a partisan observation, this is just a legal assessment. I have seen plenty of lawsuits in my 12 plus years of litigation. This is how a lawsuit should be drafted. So first observations based on the header, as we can read, Nick Sandmann by and through his parents and natural guardians, Ted Sandmann and Julie Sandmann. Nick Sandmann is still a minor and needs to be represented by his legal guardians, that being his parent, who file the lawsuit in his name but act for and on his behalf. Plaintiff's complaint with jury demand. This is obviously a strategic decision. The lawyers clearly want to bring this lawsuit before a trial by jury as opposed to a trial by judge. The obvious reason being that a jury is going to be much more human and receptive to the human elements of this lawsuit than a judge might be. Judges tend to see the law, while juries can be swayed by emotion. And this case is going to bring up emotion. A lawsuit tells a story. If it is a well-drafted lawsuit, it is going to tell a clear, concise, well-structured story. You have some stories that are convoluted where you can't understand the plot line, and you have some lawsuits that are drafted like that. A good story is clear, concise, and structured. A good lawsuit is clear, concise, and structured as well. Now, there is no cookie-cutter way to structure any given lawsuit. Generally speaking, it helps to go in chronological order, to identify your parties, to break down the lawsuit into various chapters. And that is exactly what the lawyers in this file have done. In the introductory paragraphs, the lawyers define the party. They go through the history of NBC, and there is a very specific strategic reason for which they do this. They talk about NBC being founded in 1926 by Radio Corporation of America, which was owned at the time by General Electric. They talk about how NBC Universal is wholly owned by Comcast Corporation, a global media and technology conglomerate which is the second largest broadcasting and cable television company in the world. They then go through a history of mergers and acquisitions to explain how NBC has become what it is today. And why do they do this? It's not just to show that it's a multi-billion-dollar heartless corporation. It's to show the extent and vast network. When they run defamatory stories about a 16-year-old high school kid, it reaches the world, thus exacerbating the damages that will ultimately be claimed by Nick Sandmann. The lawyers then go in to describe NBC Universal's political bias. At paragraph 18 and following, they talk about NBC having a well-known bias in favor of liberal political views and against conservative political views. This is necessary not just to set the context or demonize the adversary, but this is necessary to tell the story, the intention, the motivation. It's necessary to flesh out the intention of the defendant, because they are going to have to allege malice at some point in this lawsuit. They're going to have to establish malice, and they're going to have to establish an intent for that malice. And right now what they're sort of doing is laying the foundation to the story that they're going to be telling of a reckless news broadcaster that knowingly ran with an inaccurate story because it fit the agenda and narrative that they were pushing forward as a news agency. At paragraph 21, they then go into Comcast's 2018 net profits of over $11 billion. At paragraph 23, to further flesh out the vast network and reach of NBC-operated stations, they talk about how as of December 31st, 2018, they reached over 32 million households in America. Again, not an accident, laying the foundation for the fact that when NBC ran with these defamatory statements, they basically reached all of America. Paragraph 25. Between January 19th and January 27th, 2019, NBC Universal unleashed its vast corporate wealth, influence, and power against Nicholas to falsely attack him despite the fact that at the time, he was a 16-year-old high school student. Something else I've said in the past, and I'll say it again in the future, these are not facts. These are allegations. These are allegations that are going to have to be proven at trial. Now, some of these allegations are more demonstrable fact, like net profits for 2018. Other allegations are more descriptive in nature. They're more emotional in nature. And so you can imagine what you have to do in order to prove that Comcast's profits were a little over $11 billion in 2018. But then you also have to appreciate that with an allegation using terms like falsely attack, what you're going to have to prove in order to show not just that there were attacks, but that the attacks were false. But right now what they're trying to hammer home with these introductory paragraphs is the fact that at the time all of this went down, and the multi-billion-dollar corporation NBC was utterly destroying the life of a 16-year-old kid based on an unverified 60-second video that appeared on Twitter. At paragraph 27, we can sort of see how the lawyers are structuring the rest of this lawsuit. You can see that they're breaking down the defamation into various categories. You've got 15 defamatory broadcasts, 6 defamatory online articles, and many tweets falsely accusing Nicholas and his Covington Catholic high school classmates of racist acts, including, among other things, engaging in racist conduct by instigating a threatening confrontation with several African American men. And with more of the introductory allegations, we know exactly what they're going to argue. Over the course of its coverage, NBC failed and refused to acknowledge that Nicholas did nothing wrong and continued to perpetuate its false narrative for over 1 week following the January 18th incident. And at paragraphs 57 and 58, we have allegations to the effect that NBC Universal never corrected its false reporting, and the lawyers compare it to other media outlets that did in fact issue retractions or corrections, ostensibly in an attempt to show the difference between responsible media coverage and irresponsible malicious media coverage. And at paragraphs 60 and 61 of the introductory paragraphs, we have the damages being claimed by Nick Sandmann. $75 million for compensatory damages and $200 million in punitive damages. Now, I am a Quebec lawyer, and we live in a different universe when it comes to compensatory and punitive damages. And while these might seem excessive on their face, punitive damages are necessarily supposed to be a deterrent. For a company with a net profit of over $11.5 billion in 2018, what type of condemnation is actually going to be an effective deterrent to this type of conduct in the future? As for the compensatory damages, it's going to be up to these lawyers to actually make the evidence that these damages are justified or justifiable. But from a Canadian Quebec legal perspective, $75 million for compensatory damages is not just another ballpark, it's another ballpark on another universe. Paragraph 63 and following is a detailed breakdown of what actually occurred during the January 18th incident. And like with the Mueller report, none of this is actually news to anybody who was following the events at the time. Incidentally, if you haven't seen my vlog and breakdown of the Mueller report, check it out right here. But anybody who followed the news in the days and weeks following the January 18th incident knows exactly what happened. At first, a video emerged appearing to show a smirking kid wearing a MAGA hat, taunting a Native American elder. The video goes viral, the tweets go viral, the media frenzy begins. Nick Sandmann starts getting death threats, his family starts getting death threats. It's madness. The media continues to run with the story, turning it into an even greater media frenzy. And shortly after the incident, a much longer video detailing exactly what happened from beginning to end emerges. And what became relatively clear to most is that the Covington Catholic kids were not instigating anything. On the contrary, they were being harassed by another group of activists who were there on the scene. They did not approach Nathan Phillips and stand in his face. On the contrary, Nathan Phillips approached them and began banging his drum several inches from Nick Sandmann's face. Nick Sandmann, being an uncomfortable 16-year-old kid not knowing what to do, stood there smiling while Nathan Phillips banged the drum in his face, and eventually they all went off their separate ways. But as the lawsuit will allege, notwithstanding the fact that it became relatively clear relatively quickly that the story was misrepresented from the beginning, various news outlets continued to push and promote the false narrative that they had been reporting on from the very beginning, one of which was NBC Universal. Paragraph 107 talks about the fact that shortly after the incident, in an attempt to sort of curb the frenzy, Nick Sandmann gave a public statement attempting to set the record straight. Paragraph 108 talks about the fact that shortly after the incident, Nick Sandmann agreed to a sit-down interview with Savannah Guthrie. And at paragraph 108 and following, they talk about the fact that not not only did the Guthrie interview not set the record straight, but Guthrie engaged in what they call victim shaming, asking Nick Sandmann presumptuous and accusatory questions like, don't you think you have anything to apologize for? It's alleged that NBC continued to run with inaccurate headlines to the effect that Nick Sandmann refuses to apologize, or Nick Sandmann doesn't think he has anything to apologize for. What became clear after the fact is that Nathan Phillips gave a number of television interviews in which he clearly misrepresented what actually happened based on video evidence that subsequently became available. And according to the lawsuit, NBC, in their continued defamatory coverage of this event, when they ran the Sandmann interview, framed it as a Nick Sandmann refuses to apologize and Nathan Phillips is forgiving. All of which had been contradicted by the full video that subsequently became available that gave context to the 60-second clip that went viral. Up until now, the allegations have been ones telling the story of what actually occurred. Now we are going to get into the allegations of why NBC is to blame and why NBC is at fault. Paragraph 123 is an allegation to the effect that the Diocese of Covington announced that they were going to hire independent third-party investigators to conduct an investigation of what actually occurred on January 18th. These allegations are being made and the report being filed not only to show what actually happened, but to show what a responsible news agency ought to have done before reporting on the incident, given the nature of the situation, that being that we are dealing with a situation involving minors, and a story that quickly exploded and could have had catastrophic consequences on those involved. Paragraph 142 alleges that NBC Universal was among the first broadcasters to begin airing Nathan Phillips' defamatory interviews. And paragraph 143 and following are very interesting. It alleges that NBC Universal posted false and defamatory articles on January 19th, that is to say one day after the event. Paragraph 144 further alleges that the event was not newsworthy or breaking news that required such urgent media coverage. The allegation is to the effect that this incident was not national news. It was not hot or breaking news. There was no need to run with media reports without having first conducted a proper investigation, all the more so given the fact that we are dealing with minors in this situation. And in my humble opinion, this is a very tactical way of laying the groundwork for proving the case they're going to need to prove against NBC Universal. They are writing a story to the effect that there was nothing urgent, breaking, or necessary in this situation that could have otherwise trumped their obligations to investigate and verify that on which they were reporting. All the more so given the fact that we are dealing with minors. Paragraph 146 to 148, they talk about the fact that NBC, instead of correcting their inaccurate reporting, doubled down and then tripled down on their original defamatory and inaccurate reporting. Again, strengthening the foundation of the arguments that they're going to have to prove in order to show the malice of NBC Universal in order to prove the damages. In furtherance of a story they wanted to promote because it fit their narrative as alleged earlier on in this lawsuit. And you may not agree with the allegations or how this is being drafted in this lawsuit. We're just reading a story right now, and this is the story that Nick Sandmann's lawyers are telling. A politically biased news agency with an axe to grind comes across a story that fits their narrative perfectly, jumps on it despite the fact that there is nothing urgent or breaking about it, and creates a media frenzy that is unjustified in fact and actually dangerous for the subjects involved. Like it or not, that story is being told well in this lawsuit. Paragraph 149 and follows, we talk about parties, jurisdiction, and venue. These are all technical allegations so they can establish a jurisdiction of the court and a geographic jurisdiction. In Quebec, you have monetary thresholds for the level of court. Small claims is a maximum of $15,000. The Court of Quebec, which is sort of under the Superior Court, has a financial threshold of $85,000. Above $85,000 and you go to the Superior Court. And you have to establish the proper jurisdiction for instituting the lawsuit. And typically that has to do with the residence of the defendant or where the cause of action arose. At the very least in Quebec, it may be different in other jurisdictions. So paragraph 149 and following, the lawyers are just setting out allegations to establish the proper court to hear the case because it exceeds a certain monetary value and the proper geographic jurisdiction. And so they make the necessary allegations in order to prove that the cause of action should be heard in, I believe, Kentucky. And at paragraph 162, they talk about the nexus to the geographic jurisdiction of Kentucky, that being the place where the damages were suffered, such that the courts of Kentucky can actually hear this case. And there are obviously strategic considerations as to what state you might want to have a trial like this be heard in. Bearing in mind that it is a trial by jury, and you might want to have a jury from the state of Kentucky deciding whether or not a 16-year-old Covington Catholic high school kid was wronged by a multi-billion-dollar national mainstream media corporation. Paragraphs 167 and follows get into the multiple upwards of 15 broadcasts containing what Sandmann alleges were defamatory broadcasts. It goes into it in meticulous detail, but anyone who was following the events at the time already knows what happened. Basically, NBC ran a bunch of stories which were totally disproven by the video evidence that subsequently resurfaced. The argument on the merits going to be that NBC ought to have done its due diligence before running multiple broadcasts of false information. And the fact that they didn't live up to their ethical obligations to verify that on which they were reporting was motivated by bad faith and malice and furtherance of a narrative that fit their political agenda, as alleged in the proceedings. And at paragraph 356, we get into the defamatory articles that NBC published. Structured, methodical allegations in these proceedings. And the lawyer details 6 defamatory articles that NBC published in the wake of the incident, all of which contained information and pushed a narrative that was demonstrably false given the video evidence that existed shortly after the incident. All of this culminating in the position that it was a deliberate and malicious attack on Nick Sandmann and the Covington kids in furtherance of NBC's political agenda. And then at paragraph 408 and following, they deal with tweets. And we live in a world now where media has in fact gone to social media outlets in order to find and report on news. And they tweet and they retweet tweets that are not necessarily accurate. And given their vast network as previously and deliberately alleged in these proceedings, these false, inaccurate, and defamatory tweets can reach tens and hundreds of millions of people in the push of a button. And one of the biggest news broadcasters out there is partaking in the pushing of inaccurate and unverified information as alleged news. So that's the story. None of this is going to be new to anybody who was remotely following the news at the time. That being said, even today, notwithstanding the various corrections, erratums, retractions that were issued by the media, there are still people who believe the original story as it was depicted in those highly contextually inaccurate tweets. And this is going to be brought up again later on in these proceedings in that the damage is done. This defamation is like cutting a hole in a feather pillow. Once the feathers come out, you can't get them back in. Despite all of the retractions that were issued by other news outlets, but not by NBC Universal, there are still people who are convinced by the original story as it went viral. Paragraphs 418 and following are very important. Nicholas is a private figure. Now, these are important allegations in law because, as we've discussed in previous videos on defamation, the threshold is different for private figures versus public figures. Generally speaking, the threshold of what constitutes defamation is much higher for a public figure than for a private figure. And so Sandmann's attorneys, by way of these allegations, is attempting to show that Nicholas Sandmann was a private individual, not a public figure, for whom the threshold should be much lower in terms of what constitutes defamation. Prior to the January 18 incident, Nicholas had no notoriety of any kind in the community at large. Nicholas did not engage in the public's attention to resolve any public issue that could impact the community at large. Reading this allegation and the way it's drafted, the terminology it uses, seems to me to indicate the terminology or the criteria that is applicable in the jurisdiction where this is going to be heard. These lawyers know the terminology that they have to allege in order to show that Nicholas Sandmann is a private figure and not a public one. Paragraph 421. Nicholas made no public appearances prior to the false accusations against him. And this brings up a very interesting question as to whether or not a private figure can become a public figure simply by way of happenstance. Does a private figure become a public figure because they are unwillingly and wrongly thrust into the public limelight? Unclear and to be determined. But what's clear here is that the lawyers are specifically and deliberately alleging that Nicholas Sandmann is a private individual in an obvious attempt to reduce the bar as to what will constitute defamation for a private figure versus a public figure. And then we get into the burden of proof for NBC Universal. Paragraphs 424 and following. NBC Universal published negligently and maliciously. NBC Universal published its false and defamatory accusations negligently and with actual knowledge of falsity or a reckless disregard for the truth. As one of the world's leading news outlets, NBC Universal knew but ignored the importance of verifying damaging and, in this case, incendiary accusations against a minor child prior to publication. Instead, NBC Universal recklessly rushed to publish its false and defamatory accusations in order to advance its own political agenda and to create a false narrative in which it framed the January 18 incident as being part of a rising trend in, quote, hate crimes. NBC Universal's duty to investigate is heightened where, as here, the January 18 incident was not breaking news and involved a minor child. The whole story that Nick Sandmann's attorneys are trying to tell are coming together in these final allegations. And you can see by the terminology being used in these allegations what the lawyers are going to have to prove come trial time. Look at how many times the lawyers specifically use the terms negligently and recklessly. And another very interestingly drafted allegation at paragraph 455, NBC Universal published its false and defamatory accusations with common law malice demonstrated by its failure to retract its false and defamatory accusations despite the harm and danger it knew would be inflicted upon Nicholas. I imagine common law malice is the legal standard that they are going to have to prove in order to succeed on a claim for defamation. I don't know exactly what common law malice is or how it is proven, but it is clear that the lawyers know they're going to have to prove that specific standard, and presumably they have drafted all of the previous allegations accordingly so that they can actually prove common law malice in order to succeed on their claim. And then to finish it up with the damages, paragraph 466 and following, Nicholas is entitled to an award of punitive damages to punish NBC Universal and to deter it from repeating such egregiously unlawful misconduct in the future. And that's the kicker of punitive damages. What amount of money is actually going to hurt NBC Universal and serve as a deterrent, both to NBC Universal and all other news outlets out there, not to engage in this type of conduct in the future? $200 million? My prediction, and this is just an assessment in law, if this ever goes to trial, Nick Sandmann is going to win. He's not not necessarily going to win $75 million in compensatory damages and $200 million in punitive damages, but he's going to win something. And my prediction is susceptible of change in the event that new facts come out that I was not previously aware of. But I was closely following this at the time, and I don't think that there are radically new facts of which I am unaware that might show up in NBC Universal's defense. That being said, there are also high chances that this never gets to trial and that this gets settled well before. I suspect that NBC Universal has insurance that covers these types of claims, and that one way or another this might not be the type of thing they want to bring to a jury of 12 citizens. So on that note, if you like this breakdown, leave a little thumbs up, leave a comment, let me know what you think, and now you know your vlog. Peace out. Boom!